Greetings, Fire Chargers, Darkblade here, and I have two pieces of good news. For one, today I received in the mail a book, on the reliability of the Old Testament by Kenneth Kitchen. And for my second piece of good news, this term seems to be going down. As you can see, its peak was in late May of 2024, and it declined, though it started to climb back up in was it late July before declining again. Then from mid-August to about mid-October, it started slowly rising up again, but basically still flat. Then, once you get at the tail end of October, it was declining again. Unfortunately, it's in a little bit of a pick back up. If you go over the past 90 days, you see that it has actually been declining since yesterday. So that is also very good news. So how do I celebrate these two pieces of good news? By reacting to something. I promised, dang it, I'll find it. I'm going to be reacting to this video, The Revolutionary Mosaic Law by Inspiring Philosophy. He uploaded this video on August 6, 2021. And what does he... Oh, by the way, there is a description. Currently has 2,100 likes and 38 and almost 39,000 views. He says, the Torah is a revolutionary document that changed many ways ancient people viewed ethics and themselves. I had originally planned to react to this video, the misunderstood Mosaic Law, but the revolutionary Mosaic Law is 5 minutes shorter.
Something isn't adding up.
Skip ad.
And was culturally situated. So, in the ancient world, there existed numerous legal collections, what we commonly refer to as law codes. One of them is the Hebrew Torah, and scholars note numerous similarities between the Torah and its ancient Near Eastern counterparts.
So far we have the hook, the background.
Despite having similarities, the Torah is also revolutionary in many ways for the ancient world.
And the official hook.
It introduced new ideas and ethical considerations that are absent in other legal collections.
And there's the rotating logo.
I want to point out this is part 3 of a series, so much of what I say here will be building on these previous 2 videos.
I actually didn't remember that this was the third part. By the way, if you want to go in my comments and describe which historical era of IP logo is the best, then and to describe what the logo is, go ahead.
Where we point out the Torah was not a prescriptive law code or legislation. It was more akin to didactic wisdom literature, and was culturally situated.
Oh, I just noticed the Hebrew letters Tav, Tau, Waw, Resh, and Hey thinly appear as watermarks in these thumbnails.
So it was not intended to be universal moral legislation.
That is
despite
something
the Torah
interesting.
being intended for the standards of the ancient culture, it was still revolutionary for its time and place, challenged the ethical standards of the day, and would eventually help pave the way to many concepts and beliefs that we take for granted. To start, in the ancient Near Eastern legal collections, class distinctions were taught as social norms. In the Hittite, Assyrian, and Babylonian legal collections,
let me see, this is a Hittite law. And section 19a says, if a Luwian adopts a free person, man or woman, from the land of Hati and leads him away to the land of Luia Arzawa, and subsequently the abducted person's owner recognizes him, the abductor shall bring, i.e., forfeit, his entire house. If a Hittite abducts a Luwian man in the land of Hati himself and leads him away to the land of Luia, formerly they gave 12 persons, but now he shall give 6 persons. He shall look to his house for it.
Punishment described would change depending on who was the victim. So in the Code of Hammurabi, if a member of the upper class harmed another member of the upper class, the punishment is described as fitting the crime. If he breaks another man's bone, his bones shall be broken. But if a member of the upper class harms someone of the lower class, the punishment described is only having to pay a fine. Likewise, if someone harmed a slave, the punishment listed is paying half the price of the slave. Class distinctions of the ancient world.
The Code of Hammurabi is one of the oldest legal systems we've ever seen, if I remember correctly. It goes back to the 18th century BC. Now, according to some people, this is also the time that Abraham would have lived around. That is something. That's something to think of.
Were recognized, and the upper class was given special privileges that members of the lower classes were not entitled to. But in the Torah, class distinctions are directly challenged and rejected. Christine Hayes notes the Torah contains a unique principle of talion, which was most likely a polemic against class distinctions in other cultures. All people of Israel were taught to be treated equal. Whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good, life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him. Whoever kills an animal.
Oh, and by the way, this idea also appears in the Code of Hammurabi, from what I've learned.
Shall make it good. Whoever kills a person shall be put to death. You shall have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native, for I am the Lord your God. Some say this sounds harsh, but it is a cultural misunderstanding on our part. Douglas Stewart notes there is no evidence an Israelite judge literally required an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. The expression was understood idiomatically to mean a penalty that hurts the person who ruins someone else's eye as much as he would be hurt if his own eye were actually ruined also. Whatever that was left for local courts to take the circumstances into consideration. Stewart says,
So what he's saying is that the actual punishment is left to the discretion of the individual courts. Is that right?
Function, the prevention of powerful people using their money and influence to get their own way in the courts. Eye for eye, therefore, means in effect completely fair without regards for wealth or status of the persons involved. So instead of being taught the upper class had special privileges, the Torah taught all free citizens should be seen as equal. Reverend Child says, the principle of lex talionis marked an important advance and was far from being a vestige from a primitive age.
It's hard to put into words the
And
horrors
this
that we
is an
witness
ad.
every day during our time here. Entire families coming.
Primitive age.
This casts the principle of talion, I hope, in a new light. The law of talion, which is essentially the principle that a person should be punished according to the injury they inflicted. It's been decried as a primitive, archaic reflex of the vengeance or vendetta principle. The notion of an eye for an eye, it's usually cited or held up as typical of the harsh and cruel standards of the vengeful Old Testament God. But when you look at it in a comparative light, in its legal context, we see that it's a polemic against the class distinctions that were being drawn in antecedent and contemporary legal systems, such as the Code of Hammurabi. According to the Bible, the punishment should always fit the crime, regardless of the social status of the perpetrator on the one hand or the victim on the other.
So in this case, it's more like an example of being progressive an eye for an eye for everyone, as opposed to other places that were doing, like, if you're rich and your victim is not rich or not elite, then it's like $100 for an eye or something like that.
See a strong emphasis on humanitarian aid in the Torah. Israel is constantly reminded to love the stranger as yourself, provide for the poor and helpless, and be compassionate as much as possible. It was taught foreigners were to be treated as equals, which is a strong stance against racist and ethnocentric tendencies. God,
But there, if I remember correctly, there are some laws that don't seem to be in, like, full accordance with this, with such an egalitarian principle. And again, I think, if I remember correctly, many of those are like laws relating to religious ceremonies.
warned that he was on the side of the helpless and the weak.
You shall not mistreat a widow or a fatherless child. That is correct. I think there is one verse that says that if you, like, mistreat a widow and an orphan and they cry out, then God will step in and remove you from the realm of the living as the punishment. And thus your children and wife will become like what the victim of your mistreatment was.
These were the people God was looking out for, and Israel was called to imitate God in this way.
Wait, I want to read
that he was on the side of the helpless and the weak.
And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, the tribe of Levi was not given territory or land. And the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are with your towns shall come out and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work that you...
These were the people God was looking out for, and Israel with...
You shall not pervert justice due to the sojourner or the fatherless, or take a widow's garment in pledge, but you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you to do this. When you reap your harvest in field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back and get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. So these laws about treating foreigners fairly are deeply tied with and associated with the historical reality of the Israelites' time spent in Egypt. Yeah. And what does it mean to pervert the justice due to a sojourner or to the fatherless? Does it mean to, like, be unduly sympathetic towards them because of their status, or to be, like, harsh and discriminatory against them because of their status? I don't know.
It's called to imitate God in this way. The Torah taught Israel ought to help the
holy
needy
as
and
I am
helpless,
holy.
because this is what God does. Israel was called to imitate him in offering humanitarian aid as an extension of his identity. Ken Campbell said,
Yeah, there's one verse that's I don't remember where it is, but it basically says that if a poor person borrows something from you and gives you their cloak as collateral, then you should return their collateral, their cloak, to them that same day.
Deuteronomy 10:18 adds that the Israelites were to look to Yahweh himself as the paradigm for treating the economically and socially vulnerable persons in their communities.
Let me find that verse. 10:18 says, as he executes justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing.
Wanted his people to represent him was in caring for the weak and helpless. Deuteronomy 15 teaches a
So
description
welfare
of
is
what
biblical.
compassion should look like. It
If
states there
there's
ought to be no poor among the Israelites, and to give freely to end poverty, for there will never cease to be poor in the land. People today have taken this verse to mean because there will always be poverty. There's no reason to give to charity. But the Torah
I actually
said
want
to give
to
freely
read
to end
that
poverty.
and I'll read it from if there is a poor person among you, one of your brothers within any of your gates in the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you must not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards your poor brother. Instead, you are to open your hand to him and freely loan him enough for whatever he has. Be careful that there isn't this wicked thing in thought in your heart. The 7th year, the year of canceling debts, is year, and you are stingy towards your poor brother and give him nothing. He will cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty. Give to him, and don't have a stingy heart when you give. Because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you do. For there will never cease to be poor among your land. That is why I am commanding you. You must willingly open your hand to the afflicted and poor brother in your land. So basically, every 7 years, debts were to be annulled. And some people are thinking, oh, it's almost time for the annulment. So if I give him money, I won't be paid anything back. So I'm not going to give this person any money. And this passage commands against that mentality.
For there will never cease to be poor in the land. People today have taken this verse to mean because there will always be poverty. There's no reason to give to charity. But the Torah meant for this statement to mean the opposite, that poverty is such a horrible and persistent problem that the Hebrews ought to always be ready to lend to the poor. Even though we noted the ancient legal collections were not prescriptive legislation, we can still observe that the descriptive nature of the punishments in the Torah were more humane than their other ancient Near Eastern counterparts. The Middle Assyrian laws, for example, are considered to contain some of the harshest laws of any ancient Near Eastern collection.
The Middle Assyrian laws explicitly authorize inhumane treatment of a deserting wife. You can cut off her ears. Legalize violence in the case of a distrainee. A distrainee is a pledge, someone who has been placed in your house because of a debt and is working for you. The citizen may do what he wishes as he feels the distrainee deserves. He may pull out his hair. He may mutilate his ears by piercing them. Middle Assyrian laws also legalize violence against a wife. When she deserves it, a seigneur may pull out the hair of his wife, mutilate or twist her ears. There's no liability attaching to him.
In contrast, scary. Within the Torah, we don't see descriptive
these Middle Assyrians like sanctioned, what is it called? And spousal ABUSX, not gonna finish that one. And for reference, the Middle Assyrian Empire was from 1363 to 912 BC.
Punishments of mutilation or other types of extreme inhumane practices, as bad as they are in the other ancient texts. Michael Wolzer even admits, it has often been said that Israelite law, the three codes taken together, is more advanced, that is, more humanitarian, liberal, and so on, than that of other ancient peoples.
So social progressiveness is biblical.
He goes on to note sometimes the Torah describes more harsh punishments for specific crimes. But these seem to be crimes that are direct offenses to God, and still not necessarily prescriptive.
Mosaic law.
Others seem to be because the Torah.
So the first was the misunderstood Mosaic law, and the second was the imperfect Mosaic
places
law.
A higher value on human life and less value on property. To elaborate what I mean, in other legal collections, death is at times described as the proper punishment for stealing or other property crime.
If a free man steal a plow, I can't improve the quality, and his owner finds it, he shall be put the offender's neck upon it, and he shall be put to death by the oxen. So, What's that? Basically, this Hittite law is like saying if someone steals your plow, you can execute them by having your cows run over their neck. If anyone steals a bronze spear in the gate of the palace, he shall be put to death. Well, presumably that's a more serious crime because bronze spears around palace gates are presumably supposed to be used for protecting the king. And by stealing bronze spear, you are negatively impacting the guard's ability to protect the king. And the famous Middle Assyrian law. If a man is either ill or dead, and his wife steals something from his house and gives it to another man, either to a man or to a woman or to anyone else, they are to kill the man's wife along with the ones who received the stolen goods. So they basically execute both parties to the conspiracy. If anyone steals the property of a temple or of the court, he shall be put to death, and also the one who receives the stolen thing from him should be put to death. So in this case, it would probably be perceived as a more socially serious crime than stealing in general, because if you're stealing from the temple or from a royal court, then that's either an offense against a religion or an offense against the king. If anyone break a hole into a house, break it into steal, he should be put to death before that hole and should be buried. Like you try to break a hole into someone's house, well, the Code of Hammurabi would have you unalived in front of that hole you made. If anyone is committing a robbery and is caught, then he shall be put to unalivement.
But in the Torah, death is never described for infringements on property. Moshe Greenberg has shown that other legal collections can describe a fine.
The traditional the biblical punishment for stealing is like paying a fine or premium. For example, there's one thing where if you steal something, you have to steal a certain amount of something, you have to pay back the original value that you took plus an extra fifth. And stealing animals, you have to pay back a certain times more animals. And if you can't pay that amount, then you are legally required to work for your victim for a certain period of time. It's similar to how in fiction and TV shows they have people who eat at a restaurant and can't pay their bill and wash dishes for a while. That is an analogous trope in fiction, I think.
As to proper payment for a murder. But the Torah describes justice as being that a murderer cannot pay his way out. Death was the only just.
Moreover, you shall accept. Oh, I'm already at 20. I'm not even halfway through the video, and my recording time is already longer than the video itself.
Way to deal with murder. In the context of the ancient Near East, Greenberg says the Torah places more value on human life and less value on property. In other legal collections, property can be valued more than life, seen in the fact that death can be described as the proper punishment for theft, and one can pay their way out of a murder. But the Torah implied.
So some cases are like, if you unalive someone, here, pay like 1,000 shekels or whatnot, and we'll call it a day. But if you steal something from the temple grounds, you're going to be unalived, sentenced to unalivement. However, the biblical text flips that on its head.
Human life should be seen as more valuable. Murder can only be dealt justly by executing the murderer. Kidnapping also is described as deserving death, given that human life was seen as valuable. But stealing is not described as a crime worthy of death. Greenberg argued the Torah reverses the standard of the ancient Near East, that life was cheap and property was more valuable. David Baker says, the penalties prescribed for theft in the Bible are much more humane than in most ancient Near Eastern laws, and never involve mutilation, beating, or death.
It's shocking how much of the equipment we've used for decades contains forever chemicals. This is the first innovation.
Mutilation, beating, or death. We also see vicarious punishments minimized in the Torah. In other legal collections, a described punishment will often be something like if a poorly built house kills someone's son, then the builder's son has to die. Or if someone rapes another man's daughter, then the rapist's wife is to be raped.
Well, that is obviously very messed up inordinately. It might be a little messed up if the perpetrator's wife was an accomplice. And also the idea of a house falling down, that could be caused by a whole array of circumstances outside of the control of people involved in the construction of the house.
These are lacking in the biblical text and contain possible polemics against this type of legal teaching. Exodus 21 says that if an untamed ox gores a son or daughter of someone else, then the ox owner is the one held responsible, not the child of the ox owner. Deuteronomy.
Yeah, and if the ox gores someone to the point of unalivement, then the ox is to be stoned to unalivement. However, if it was already known that the ox was a gorer, presumably non-lethally, and the owner just didn't do anything to stop it, then the owner is also held responsible. I want to... and here in the ESV, Exodus 21:16 says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. If that's the correct translation, then it means that not just the kidnapper is executed, but whoever receives the kidnapper victim, they're considered accomplices or part of the conspiracy.
24:16 even states, fathers should not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin.
Judicial responsibility for an offense falls on the person who committed the offense and on no one else.
In other words, the Torah encouraged the idea of personal responsibility, instead of the ancient Near Eastern custom of a family member suffering the consequence for your crime in place of you. There is a debate on whether or not slavery in the Bible included real chattel slavery, where slaves were seen as the literal property of masters, or if all slaves were merely indentured servants, meaning that they were not really slaves like antebellum slaves. In part of this series, we argue that regardless of this debate, the biblical texts admit the Torah was not perfect and was culturally situated wisdom. So we don't have
God, what is that word? Accommodated himself to the people. It was a compromise. And some people like Kyle Davidson Bear on Quora and on his personal Pastor Kyle Substack argue that there is no legal slavery at all, and that it was just unconditionally prohibited from the get-go in the Old Testament.
worry about the question on whether or not slavery in the Bible included chattel slavery. But setting aside that debate for now, there is still a push towards humanitarian treatment of slaves in the Torah. As we noted, Israel was commanded to love the foreigner and treat them as one of their own. The rationale for this is in places like Exodus 22:21 and 23:9, which teaches that Israel was once foreigners in the land of Egypt, and they ought to remember how they were treated there. So don't
So again, what is it called? This more egalitarian approach and not being mean or discriminatory to foreigners is strongly rooted in the historical reality of the Israelites' time in Egypt as something that actually happened.
Oppress and enslave foreigners in your land like you were oppressed in Egypt. Reverend Child says, Verse 9 voices a familiar concern over the stranger,
and by the way, there's a lot of evidence for that time in
to
Egypt.
acts of violence and injustice by his isolated position. The motivation clause, which suddenly shifts to the plural form, once again reminds Israel of her Egyptian bondage.
The
implication
shifting
of the
the plural,
Pentateuch
something about
is not
grammar.
to do what Egypt did by oppressing foreigners and treating them unfairly. So there is an implication in the Torah. Slaves, regardless of their status, must be treated fairly and cannot be oppressed. Ken Campbell notes, although slaves were viewed as the property of the...
Oh yeah, and there's one law that says that if you cause your slaves certain levels of injury, like knocking their tooth out, then you are legally required to emancipate them. And I'm just using the word slave for convenience sake, because that's the word that's used in the video, and it's the one that's used in the ESV right in front of me.
Heads of households. The latter were not free to brutalize or abuse even non-Israelite members of the household. On the contrary, explicit prohibitions of the oppression, exploitation of slaves appears repeatedly in the Mosaic legislation. Like Exodus 22:20, in both texts, Israel's memory of her own experience as slaves in Egypt should have provided motivation for compassionate treatment of her slaves.
English 21. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Apparently, in the original Hebrew, it would be considered verse 20.
As having a right to a Sabbath rest, be allowed to participate in important religious practices, should not be abused, could only be marked or branded if they wanted to be, and could not be killed on the whims of their master. Some might attempt to argue some of the stipulations only apply to indentured servants and not chattel slaves. But that is assuming these are necessarily prescriptive laws, which we argued is not likely in part 1. Instead, what we see is culturally situated wisdom on what justice looked like in that time period. One is meant to learn from the holistic wisdom of the Torah regarding the proper way to act, and what the Torah is pushing towards is a more humanitarian approach to the treatment of slaves.
9 minutes left.
Which is why we see the Torah including wisdom with much...
Let me try to set this. Select this to 720.
More humane treatment of slaves.
That didn't seem to have done nothing. And it's not just that the servants or slaves, if you would rather use that word, are given the Sabbath rest, but that they, like everyone else in ancient Israel, was legally required to observe the Sabbath rest.
Skeptics may also attempt to cite Exodus 21:20-21, where it says that if a master hits his slave and the slave lives, then there's no punishment for the master. But this is cherry picking, as just a few verses later, the authors add that the slave also must be set free, even for small infractions. So it is not true that Torah describes justice.
Knocking an eye out isn't exactly a small infraction, and let me look up how much force is needed to knock a tooth out. I'll pause the screen recorder too. I gave up.
as masters being allowed to abuse their slaves within an inch of their lives. Also must be set free, even for small infractions. So it is not true that Torah describes justice as masters being allowed to abuse their slaves within an inch of their lives.
What is this image of?
Christopher Wright points out, no other ancient Near Eastern law has been found that holds masters to account for the treatment of his own slaves, as distinct from injury done to the slave of another master. Walter Eitroth says, the norms given in the Book of the Covenant reveal, when compared with related law books of the ancient Near East, radical alterations in legal practice, in the evaluation of the offenses against property, in the treatment of slaves, in the fixing of punishment for indirect offenses, and in the rejection of punishment by mutilation. The value of human life is recognized as incomparably greater than all material values. Even the rights of the lowliest foreigner are placed under the protection of God, and if he is also dependent without full legal rights, to oppress...
Oh, in the literal meaning of the Hebrew word used for this idea of remaining alive in some translations of Exodus 21:21 literally means stand.
Him is like oppressing the widow and the orphan, a transgression worthy of punishment, which calls forth God's avenging retribution.
7 minutes left.
Performance that truly matters. Shen Yun. Get tickets.
I'm not sure what that
So
is.
the Torah radically challenged the ethical standards of the day and has a strong push towards humanitarian aid. Slaves could not be abused or treated harshly. The poor and the helpless were to be cared for.
And if a slave escaped from their master, it was illegal to repatriate them. You had to let them stay.
All were equal before God and judges, regardless of class distinctions. People were responsible for their own sins, and the value of human life was perceived as much greater than what we see in other legal collections. This is not to say there were not humanitarian measures in other cultures, or presented in other legal collections. However, the Torah goes further in many ways, as we've noted, and also it has a much stronger emphasis on humanitarian aid, equality, and ethical demands. More importantly, is how the Torah grounds these teachings. In the ancient Near East outside of Israel, there was no formal understanding of integrity and guilt. All wrongdoing centered around public honor and public shame. One did good to receive public honor, and one did not do what was perceived as bad, so you would not receive public shame.
Yeah, I think there's one part verse in the Bible that is directly in the face of the idea of doing good for the purpose of receiving public honor. And that's, I think it says, when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets. So don't, do good stuff for clout.
Good and evil were public ideas, not personal ideas. Ethical demands were grounded in the community and public appearances. If a woman committed adultery, and neither her nor the participant told anyone, there was no sin committed, since it brought no public shame. Things were only bad if it brought dishonor among the community. Karl Vandertorn says, the Babylonians did not have an introspective tradition and had little sense of interiority. Subjectivity had not been invented yet. The virtual absence of interiority and subjectivity in the Babylonian autobiographical tradition follows from the concept of person as a social role and character. Individual identity, in this view, is not what you are deep down, but what you manifest to be. It is public and social. But in the Torah, obligations and virtues are grounded in God. So something is still wrong if no one sees it, or it doesn't affect the community. Sin is moved to a personal level between you and God, not between you and the community. This is why the Torah often teaches that you ought to do good to please God, regardless of how others see it. One is to love God before anyone else and realize that He is aware of all that happens. The Torah is not intending to lay down universal moral laws to follow, but it does contain teachings that promote a more ethical way to think, and new ways for the ancient culture to think about why one should live more ethically. Within the Torah, after certain stipulations are presented, a phrase often appears: I am the Lord your God. Scholars note this phrase is used to teach one is personally beholden to the God who sees all, not just a community. In essence, it reminds Israel they are to do good because it is God who sees their actions, and they are primarily beholden to Him, not the courts or the community.
The scope of the law is holistic. It's going to contain social and ethical and
Even
moral
if
and religious
society
prescriptions,
doesn't
and
know
very
what
often
you
they're going to
did,
be couched
God
in an
still
authoritative,
does.
apodictic style, particularly the things that aren't enforceable in a court of law. They will tend to be the ones that are backed up by the authority of God directly. You shall do this, I, the Lord, am your God. Notice how many times that refrain is used, and it's almost always used with those unenforceable kinds of things. Love your neighbor as yourself. You know, I, the Lord, am your God. It's me who's watching out for this one, not the court.
Thus, Jean Bottero says, did morality, honest and righteous behavior, have an authentic religious and cultural value, a place in the practice of religion, a direct influence on the gods? We have never found any response in all of our documentation to such a question we ask ourselves from our own religious and biblical point of view. The ancient Mesopotamians never overtly concerned themselves with or imagined such preoccupations, which are so familiar to us. This must have been one of Moses' great revolutions in Israel, to replace the purely material maintenance of the gods with the single and sole liturgical obligation in life to obey a moral law, thereby truly rendering to God the only homage worthy of him. So the Torah laid the foundation for personal integrity and internal guilt to emerge. J.J. Finkelstein points out this biblical idea was revolutionary for how the ancient world viewed what was right and wrong, since the stipulations of the Torah introduced concepts that would lead to personal guilt, integrity, and located the idea of right and wrong in the character of God himself. Kings could not simply make decrees that contradicted the will of God. Michael Walzer notes a story in 1 Kings 21.
So, ideas that are just take them as a given in the current Western world, trace back to this judicial wisdom code.
Where King Ahab desires the vineyard of Naboth. He tries to buy it, but Naboth refuses, so Ahab reluctantly has to return to his palace, unable to acquire the vineyard. Such a story would have been peculiar to the surrounding cultures. In the ancient Near East, the king could do as he pleased and seize whatever he wanted. The legal collections of the ancient world were not given by the gods. The gods appointed rulers to establish justice and order. So the Code of Hammurabi is not wisdom from the gods. It is the wisdom of Hammurabi, and if he decided, he could seize whatever he wanted. But in Israel, the legal wisdom on the ideal way to live in that time period came from God himself. Ahab was beholden to wisdom or guidelines he could not transcend, even as king. And so he could not just seize what he wanted to, which is why his wife, a follower of Baal, uses trickery or finds a loophole to have Naboth killed.
So the king can't just take what he wants. He has to make an effort to try to legally acquire it using fair game means from the owner, who has every right to say no.
But one of the points of the story is that the Torah challenged the idea kings could do as they pleased and place real authority in God, not in human rulers. The Torah changed the way rules were viewed and placed them beyond the whims of kings and rulers. This is one reason why Jerusalem is one of the pillars of Western civilization. The Torah laid a revolutionary foundation for standards beyond human constructs.
Shouldn't the pillar be Sinai then?
Humanitarian aid and challenged the idea that there could be special legal privileges for the kings or the upper class. Although the Torah was only temporary and would one day be replaced, it laid the foundations for a revolutionary view of morality and judicial wisdom. It was an important and necessary step towards building a better world.
that's all for this video. Make sure to like and subscribe to me and to IP as well. I'll copy the link so I can post it in the description and start play it out. I'll see you tomorrow.